Okay. So welcome everybody to our program today, Critical Race Theory, Origins and Scholarship with Dr. Ingrid Banks. I am Laurel Plimier and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont. And as always, I want to thank you all for taking some time out of your day today to spend with us on Zoom and on YouTube. I know people are trickling in here and I'm just going to move forward with our introductory remarks and some of the logistics and stuff. And hopefully most people will be here by the time we get into the meat of the program. We're happy to be bringing this event to you together with the Piedmont Anti-Racism and Diversity Committee. And I know the topic of critical race theory has been in the news a lot lately, and there's a lot of misinformation swirling around it. And we're extremely fortunate to have Dr. Banks here today to help us all learn a little bit more about it. And before we get into the introduction of our speaker, I wanted to go over a few logistics. So if you are on the call here with us on Zoom, please remain muted for the duration of the event to minimize your background noise and to prevent your video from popping up on our live stream. At the end, so you can post your questions in the chat anytime now or any other time during the presentation or on the live stream comments section. And at the end of the last half of the program, I will moderate some questions, and if you want to ask questions directly, you can raise your Zoom hand and I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself. And I'll remind you about that as we get closer to that part of the presentation. And if you are joining us on YouTube, please subscribe and click the bell to get notifications of our future live stream events. And for advance notice of future events, please join our mailing list, which you can do on our website, LWVPiedmont.org. And you can also become a member of the League there, and your dues alone support the grassroots efforts of the League, both locally and at the state and national levels. So the League's efforts in voter education and advocacy are extremely important work, and we greatly appreciate your support. I'm going to now turn things over to Lois Corin, who is our action chair and a member of our program committee, and she is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Laurel. Good afternoon, happy Friday, and I'm so excited about introducing Dr. Banks and this particular topic. Dr. Ingrid Banks is Associate Professor of Black Studies and Chair of the Department of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. That would be the Gaucho folk. She earned her PhD in Comparative Ethnic Studies from the University of California at Berkeley. Go Bears! Dr. Banks' main research and teaching areas are within African American studies and include race, gender, and culture. Her research and teaching areas also examine beauty culture, Black popular culture, Black feminist theory, politics of the body, critical race theory, and ethnographic methods. She is the author of Hair Matters, Beauty, Power, and Black Women's Consciousness, New York University Press. My daughter went there to school, good. Hair Matters, Beauty, Black Women's Consciousness. Dr. Banks' publications have also appeared in Black Renaissance, Renaissance Noir, Feminist Teacher, Work and Occupations, Contemporary Sociology, the Journal of Reviews, Feminist Frontiers, and the Chronicle of Higher Education and New York Newsday. Thank you, Dr. Banks, for being here. And everyone, this will be something you will really enjoy and you will learn so much. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Lois. I really appreciate the invitation, and you've been so gracious over the past few weeks as we've organized this. And I want to thank Laurel as well. And I want to thank all of you for being here. It's nice to see some faces. A lot of times, I've been on Zoom all day, and sometimes folks have their cameras off, and that's fine, but it's also nice to see some faces, in this Zoom universe, to actually have some kind of, semblance of at least of human contact. So I'm definitely happy to, see you all and even your names. And, I'm a professor, I'm a teacher. And so I like dialogue. And one of the things that, is really important for me in thinking about critical race theory is to make sure that we enter this discussion, on maybe not a level playing field, because I certainly I probably know more about the scholarship and the origins. But if you all were able to read the three pieces that I forwarded to Lois, you actually now know about the origins or may know a little bit more, but also about the different kinds of scholarship that critical race theorists actually produce. And so, I teach a course at UCSB, Introduction to African American Studies. And, typically the enrollment is 120 students, and we get students from all across the campus, not just, the social sciences, but also humanities and fine arts, as well as STEM. And so it's really great to, talk to students who are coming from different disciplines, different fields of study, and how they, think about Black studies as a discipline, as a field of study, but also, how they think about, for example, critical race theory in their STEM classes or in their art history classes or, in their feminist studies classes. And so I am not going to subject you to answering the questions on the PowerPoint slide that I put up, but I want to give you all a sense of how I go about teaching critical race theory. And it's really based on the readings. And these are the three readings. There are a couple of others, but these are, I guess, the mainstay readings that I actually use in my Introduction to African American Studies course. So I'm going to put up the PowerPoint slide. And you can see exactly what students see during the week that we actually study critical race theory. All right, I see something. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Oh, yes, there we go. And can everyone see this? Awesome. Okay, I am going to play from the start. All right. So on the first day that I teach critical race theory now, the students will have read everything that you read. But this is the first slide that I put up to contextualize some of the issue or the main issue that critical race theorists grapple with. And it's based on the liberal theory of race. And those who embrace a liberal theory of race argue that we live in a meritocratic society. There is no racial discrimination whatsoever. There's no racial injustice. We actually, everybody has equal chance, equal opportunity to do whatever they want to do, to become whatever they want to become, a doctor, attorney, a singer, a lawyer, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there are two aspects of the liberal theory of race. One is colorblindness. And colorblind theorists argue that we do not see race. And not only that we don't see race, but we shouldn't take race into consideration. Post-racialists say, look, we are over or beyond race. And many folks who embrace this position say, look, Barack Obama was elected president. So now Black man gets into office, it's all good. So we are beyond that. And one of the things I say to my students, I said, so the day that President Obama took oath, did institutionalized racism end in this country? And the question is no. And we can look at it with regard to the racial wealth gap, inequalities or racial inequalities based on housing, based on health, a number of things. And so what are the ramifications? So the liberal theory of race And these colorblind and post-racial arguments promote and maintain the status quo, as well as promote ahistoricism, meaning that we don't even look at history. History no longer matters. History is over, right? But that ignores how race shapes folks' life chances, and not just people of color, but also white Americans. Race shapes all of our lives in some way. And sometimes it's personal, but sometimes it's actually material. And that's when we get into structure and how racism really operates. And I put this note here that liberal theories also exist about gender, sexuality, and class. And so if someone says, look, men and women have equal opportunity, equal chance of becoming a congressperson, for example. Well, there are 27% of Congress is female, but women make up 50.5% of our population in the US. So those numbers should be higher. Now, some might argue that, well, women, are less likely to run for office, or women aren't interested in running for office, or women are unqualified to run for office. We know that's incorrect, because what that does is maintain the status quo and say that, well, men are the ones who have the chops, the smarts to actually lead this country. And we've seen that is definitely not the case in every case. But also around sexuality and class, folks, LGBTQ folks don't have the same life chances as straight folks. But then it gets murky because a Black, poor, gay woman is not going to have the same life chances as a gay, white male who works on Wall Street. And that's one of the things that critical race theorists look at, intersectionality, right? It's really, really important. And I have this note here that, the League of Women Voters was founded 6 months prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Why did those suffragists, most of them women, but there were some men, certainly, but why did they feel compelled to even push for a League of Women Voters, but also to get women to vote? Well, women weren't politically unsavvy or politically inferior. It's just that women were denied the right to vote based on the beliefs of a patriarchal society that said, look, women should exist in the household. If women work outside of the household, they should do so through charity work, for example, right? So, the League of Women Voters, didn't just come out of nowhere. Didn't come out, it was a reaction to the fact that women for centuries had been systematically denied the right to vote in this country, right? Just like with the voting rights of 1965, Black people had been systematically denied the right to vote in this country, right? So I'm going to go to the next slide. And let me see. Oops. And so this is. I'm sorry, my mouse is a little sensitive. And so this is one of the readings that I gave Lois to put up on the website for the League of Women Voters in Piedmont. And so this is the introduction to the book, Words That Wound, Critical Race Theory, Assaultive Speech, and the First Amendment. And this came out in 1993. And I don't know about you all, but when I read that introduction now, and I'm talking about just the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, even though this was written in the early 90s, it reminds me so much of what we've been dealing with in this country over the last 5, 6 years. And so that's why I'm always saying to my students, history is not over. We see some of the same things happening over and over and over again. And so these are some of the, leading scholars of critical race theory, and you read their names in this introduction. Charles Lawrence, who's at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, law professor. Marie Matsuda, also a law professor at the history in the department, in the law school at University of Hawaii, Manoa. Richard Delgado is a law professor at the University of Alabama, and Kimberly Crenshaw is a law professor at UCLA and Columbia. And so, again, nothing we don't come to this world in a vacuum. Critical race theory didn't just pop up in the last year or two. It's been around for decades, and it has an origin. And so that's what I want all of us to understand. And I certainly want my students to understand that as they read this work. And so we see the origins of critical race theory begins with the Harvard Law School protest in 1981. And during that time, Marie Matsuda and Kimberly Crenshaw were actually students. And so again, I'm not going to subject you all to answering these questions, but as you read in this introduction, critical race theory, came about because there wasn't really grappling with understanding how racial inequality occurs or happens or exists within the law. And we know the scales of justice, right? We see her, they're blind, but we can look at cases over and over again and see that actually justice has not always been blind in this country. Or the law has not always been blind. And then how is racism conceptualized within critical race theory? Well, structurally, because we always imagine that, it's the folks who hate, the folks who put on the hoods, the KKK hoods. Those are the racists, right? But, racism isn't simply about hating someone because of the color of their skin. It's when your ideas are actually supported by institutions and structures of power, like the educational system, employment, housing, et cetera, et cetera. And we can talk about that once I finish all of this slide stuff. And so what are the defining elements of critical race theory? And you all read that, and we can certainly talk about these within the context of the other readings. Kimberly Crenshaw's Colorblindness, History, and the Law in the book, The House That Race Built. And this is a 1997 piece. And this, I mean, it's a short piece, but it packs a big punch. And I like to assign this because it's a perfect example of critical race theory scholarship. And it's different than what we see with Derek Bell in The Space Traders. And this is actually one of my favorite essays to read, to teach. I always think about this particular essay by Kim Crenshaw and another one of hers, Whose Story Is It Anyway? Anti-Racist and Feminist Appropriations of Anita Hill. And that's where she continues to engage her theory of intersectionality. But, there's some great things in this piece too. She discusses Plessy versus Ferguson, the Brown v. Board decision in 1954, and it struck down Plessy. And, she talks about how Brown has been used to do the ideological work of legitimating racial hierarchy. She also discusses a more recent case in 1989, Richmond v. Croson. And she does this great, this amazing analysis in showing how Plessy lives in Croson. And then she has this wonderful statement. Again, I'm like, wow, why didn't I think of that? She says, it is fairly obvious that treating different things the same can generate as much inequality as treating the same things differently. And perhaps we can have a discussion about that once we move to our Q&A. And The Space Traders. And this is Derek Bell's parable And the parable is a story that attempts to convey some kind of message, right? That there might be some kind of moral to the story. And this is from his book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. And again, this was published in 1992. And what I asked my students when we discussed this in class is, how is Bell's parable an example of critical race theory? That is, how are the defining elements of critical race theory illustrated in the Space Trader? And students who get the star of the day say, hey, Professor Banks, that 27th Amendment to the Constitution is a perfect example of colorblind legislation, of a colorblind law, that fictive 27th Amendment to the Constitution. And students love this. They love this story, and it really helps them even understand things that we discussed in prior weeks. One of the things that I think is so striking in talking about why the liberal theory of race and colorblind ideology and post-racial ideology are problematic is because they're saying that, race doesn't matter, or race no longer matters. And I think when I teach about the racial wealth gap, I've been thinking about doing, I put up a number of graphs, and these are this is an older graph from 2011, but it's striking. When we look at the median net worth of households in 2005 and 2009, and this is coming, this is from the Pew Research Center, that then certainly comes from census data. So here we have. In 2005, we see the net worth of white households at $134,992. For Hispanics or Latinx folks, $18,359. For Blacks, $12,124. That is striking. But what we see 4 years later in 2009 is that all three of these racial groups took a hit, but still, whites are doing, better. Whites are doing way better than Hispanics and Blacks. And Blacks are doing, we see that wealth going down from $12,000 to $5,600. And here's another one. And this is going to be my last slide. This is from 2012. And this was a story about how income inequality in America continues to increase. And the Great Recession of 2008 was a big factor. And here we see the racial wealth gap. And we know that wealth isn't about, income. It's actually about wealth. Wealth is another way of talking about assets. And so one of the biggest ways that, or one of the biggest paths to wealth in our country for most folks, certainly for me, is through home ownership. That's because that's an asset, but also through stocks, through bonds, right? And so when we talk about racial groups that actually have amassed wealth assets, we look here as of, in 2012, white households, 110,729. Asians, $69,590. Hispanics, $7,424. And Black, $4,955. And I apologize for not having the most recent numbers because I'm not back in the classroom until the spring. So I haven't updated anything, and I haven't been in the classroom since last fall. Being chair of my department, all of the administrative duties means that I do a little less teaching at least. But the racial wealth gap it has been increasing even since that last slide in 2012, and the pandemic even exacerbated income inequality, but also wealth inequality that has existed for centuries in this country. So yeah, so that's my quick and dirty. And so now I am happy to engage questions, and we can talk about the readings as well. You know, I certainly, I welcome dialogue. You know, I like hearing folks, you know, comments, questions. Let's do it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So if people want to raise their hands in the Zoom, I will call on you. Otherwise, if you want to post a question in chat, or if you're watching on YouTube, I know we do have a handful of people over there, you can post a comment and I'll pull those questions in also. So we have a question from Eric Wolfers. Can you unmute yourself?
All right.
Hi, Eric. And
Hello.
Please, everyone call me Ingrid. I only, you know, make my undergraduate students call me Dr. Professor. Ingrid is perfectly fine.
Great, thank you. I'm sort of fascinated by this topic and done a fair amount of reading, and I haven't quite finished the paper. I think it was kind of famous in the critical legal studies area by Randall Kennedy at Harvard Law School.
Mm-hmm.
But he has some pretty strong criticisms of the critical theorists, kind of pulls apart their ideas, not so much to say that the things that they're observing are true with respect to disparities, but that there are a lot of things that explain the disparities. And if we focus solely on race and don't dig deeper into the other issues that might be important or critical to address and make changes to, then we're maybe not really doing as much as we could do. And there's a lot of John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry have fascinating conversations. I actually had a conversation with Randall Kennedy just the other day, which I listened to, which was great. And to listen to people that really know tons of stuff, like yourself, Ingrid, about the topic. So, and then things have, for many people who want to do the right thing and be on the right side of history and all that stuff, I mean, the passion is just tremendous and overwhelming. But then, the criticism of critical race theory is that, there's a lot of things being ignored. And then so the progress is not as rapid as it could be. So I'm just curious what you teach your students with respect to the critics of critical race theory and the areas where we might want to dig deeper and, so that the discussion is not too narrow and everything's not about race because there's other factors. So.
Thank you for that, Eric. Yes, I mean, I think that, one of the issues is that people are literally taking the race and critical race theory and saying that that's the only thing that matters. I even dispel this on the first day of my introduction to African American Studies course and say, look, Black people's lives aren't only shaped by race, but by gender, class, sexuality, religion, et cetera, et cetera. And remember the introduction to words that wound and those defining elements of critical race theory. Point number 6 is that, look, critical race theorists work to actually dismantle inequality in all of its forms. And this is where intersectionality comes in, right? And so, it's just like when folks think that affirmative action legislation is passed in the early 1970s per the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And the thing that folks zero in on is race. but it also was dealing with gender discrimination, where there are qualified women, regardless of a race, who should have been getting into medical schools and law schools and business schools, but they weren't because of gender discrimination, right? But for Black women, gender and racial discrimination. And so, Eric, I've heard this a great deal, but I think that there are critics who actually do more of that censoring than critical race theorists themselves. And again, I go by what I'm reading by critical race theorists. And of course, yes, race is central, because as Matsuda et al. Point out, is that it comes out of students at Harvard saying, look, we want to understand how race shapes the law, and not just law, but also order. What happens? Because again, the law is not blind. And so, critical race theorists, and Kim Crenshaw, she is one of, the leading originators of critical race theory. And she has made an internationally renowned career based on her theory of intersectionality. And even Donald, the former President Donald Trump, his life is shaped by intersectionality, his race, his gender, his class, and race, gender, class, and sexuality, And so the thing, so I say, yes, race is central to critical race theory because it's there, it's in the title, but that's not the only thing that critical race theorists look at. And even I am critical of Black studies scholars who take this very narrow view and say, it's all about race, it's all about race. Actually, it's not. And I think that's why critical race theory is so important, because we actually pick up the work that Black women were doing at the turn of the 20th century, the Black Women's Club movement, where Black women were saying, look, our lives are shaped by race and sex. And they used the term sex, obviously, to mean gender at the time. But, and that's about intersectionality. So, and I know John McWhorter's views, I know Randall Kennedy's views, I know, but again, I don't think that they give credit, to the argument about intersectionality and how race intersects with other things, and not just race as privilege. Because look, I have a different kind of lifestyle than a poor Black woman who lives 5 miles from me here in Los Angeles, because I am a professor. I live in $1 million home, So even though we share race and gender, we don't share class. And so my life chances are going to be different than hers, but we still deal with institutionalized racism and sexism.
Sorry, can I just ask
Sure.
one other thing? I don't want to jump in front of somebody else. I mean, what I get a lot out of, listening to people like John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry is, solutions. Like how do we make for, greater levels of quality in our country? And there's a lot of people, I feel like, that boil things down to education, that, our educational system is not doing what it should be. There's kids that are graduating from high school that are functionally illiterate. And we had a long history in our country where, academic rigor was placed first, achievement was placed first. And then somehow through whatever, mechanisms in our country, some of that was taken away. And just to me, and I'm just sort of talking out loud, I mean, if every kid had access to a high quality education and they lived in the safe neighborhood, they had stability in their lives, less stress. I mean, these are the things that are pointed to that we know put people at a disadvantage, not a stable household, violence in their neighborhood, and then also just not having the ability to go to a school where it's just awesome and you can take a pathway where you can achieve as much as you can achieve with people that'll get you there. And I don't, to me, I don't see a better, in my heart, I don't see a better solution than like education. And why aren't we outraged that our educational system is failing so many kids? Why aren't we outraged that there's thousands of people killing each other, in violent areas of our country? Like there's these enormous problems that don't really seem to be part of the main conversation. But, education, I think, is, you just hear it over and over again. That's the key. That's how you get there, right? I mean, there's people fighting to get into the best charter schools in places like New York. So.
Yeah, but there's also ways in which race intersects with education. And so, I have a soul son who goes to Harvard Westlake School here in Los Angeles. And, his parents are professors at UCLA. And so, and he's a Black kid and he has tremendous advantages, right? But Black people generally in this country, dating back to enslavement, have not had equal access to education, and that matters. And so, so then education is racialized. Where we live is racialized. Many Americans in this country live in segregated neighborhoods. And so, for me, it's not just about education, but then how does race and gender and class shape education and educational opportunities? And, I know these arguments by a number of Black conservatives, who say that, well, Black people, Black kids see academic achievement as acting white. Now, my really good friend and colleague, Carolyn Tyson at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, has written a great book challenging that called Integration Interrupted. And one of the things that I say is that, when Black people are freed from slavery, there are two things that Black people do. One is to have marriages recognized, and two, to learn how to read and write. So, the very things that I hear from, and I'm just talking about Black conservatives, this argument that, well, Black people have to embrace academic achievement and not see it as acting white. Well, Black people have been doing that for centuries in this country. That's why, Brown v. Board was passed in 1954. That was about education and Black kids, Black kids, but also even Black folk who were applying to colleges, public schools, did not have equal access. And so, Eric, you're right. It is about education, but it's also about race. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure.
So, Paul, you have your hand up. Do you have a question?
Paul's looking like I want to look. I want to have my baseball cap on and my, so I can go and run after this.
I guess the question is, we talk about race, but when we start educating kids at a level of elementary school, and we tell a kid in a certain predominantly white area of the country that he's an oppressor and the other people are victim, what kind of mindset does that generate over time to his benefit? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what does that give? So this will jump a little bit off, but my whole life I tried to get closer to Black people, and it just wasn't going to happen. So now what's been asked of critical race theory is, hey, we're going to come in here and we're going to tell you that you have to look at this from a completely different area. Because I grew up in Idaho, and I had one Black friend, and I tried to have that friend, and it didn't work out. So what I'm trying to understand is, now you want to bring it into as elementary school, And what do you gain it from that? I mean, at a college level, I can see that. I see where your position is from your perspective, you talking about it, and they can take their life experiences, come in and talk to you about how they feel and everything else. But you're taking a little kid and then saying, hey, you're a victim and oppressor. That's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Paul. And I have to say, I am very, very clear about this with my students that, in teaching Black studies, we don't come in class and we start talking about our personal reactions to the readings, or our personal feelings. Because what that does is undermine Black studies, because they don't do that in chemistry. They don't do that even in history. So why do it in Black studies? And so then I say, because there's this long arc of history in which Black lives don't matter. And that term, there are Black people going back to, the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century who were saying this before the early 2010s. But, what I want to say, Paul, is this, is that one of the things, when I teach about critical race theory and white privilege, is that I always say, white students, you have nothing to feel guilty about. That doesn't do anybody any good. It doesn't do white students good. It doesn't do folks of color any good. Put that energy into actually doing social justice work, however you see it. There are different ways to get involved. Some people write checks. Some people actually hit the streets and protest. Some people write letters. There are different ways. But one of the things that there is this misconception that, teachers are going in and saying, white students, you're bad, you're bad. I even have friends who are elementary school teachers, and they're not, that's not the goal of critical race theory, not to make white students and white people feel bad. If white people feel bad, then then a nerve has been hit, right? But the problem is that it's okay to teach about a history that's whitewashed, that then and especially male whitewashed, that then makes all little girls and then little boys of color, making them think that, oh, wow, we have nothing to contribute here. It's like we don't see ourselves within the national narrative of our Republic of the United States. And that's the problem. And so, I have literally been in a classroom in which, as a student, this is a college student, but but even in high school, I had a couple of really racist professors, and being the only Black kid in AP classes, those professors made me feel like I was so inferior, despite the fact that I was extremely smart and talented. And so, it's not that teachers are trying to make, students, because I don't want anybody to come in my class and feel bad. I want them to feel bad if they're racist, sexist, homophobic, classist, elitist. Yes, you should feel bad about that shit. But you shouldn't feel bad that, okay, well, I'm white and I feel bad about being an oppressor. None of the students, in this particular historical moment were part of this oppressive system. But white people benefit from it. It benefit from that system, that centuries old, the racial wealth gap just doesn't begin during the Great Recession of 2008. It begins when Black people's labor is exploited because they don't get paid as slaves. And so that's this long history. But I think that there's this misconception that, we can talk about a colorblind history and then that's going to make everybody feel good. It's not going to make, little Black girls feel good, and sometimes it's okay for us to feel uncomfortable. when we learn things. There's nothing wrong. If I say something that's problematic in my class, and I don't think I have, but I mean, if I say something that is inappropriate, I should feel bad and I should own up to that. But if I'm talking about Thomas Jefferson, calling people of African descent ugly and ape-like, that's what the man said. I mean, it's a fact, right? Just like there are facts about racial inequality and other forms of inequality in this country. And we just can't turn a blind eye, because when we turn a blind eye, inequalities, they're like sores. And what happens to a sore when we don't take care of it? It festers, and then it boils over. It's like a cauldron. And so my position is that, by ignoring problems, by ignoring people's lives and people's experiences and histories that are deeply, that are central to our nation, we don't do service to ourselves. And I think that's a problem. So Paul, I don't want you to think that, there are teachers who are talking about critical race theory who are like in class and trying to make, white kids feel bad. That is a misconception.
Actually, there's a court case in Nevada right now over that same thing. There was a white kid in a high school and his mother's Black, and they told her that he was oppressed, or he was oppressed, and he should repent for that. And that's in the middle of a court case right now. So what I want to say is,
I think that's an outlier though.
Well, it's a lot more prevalent than you think. And the thing is, the problem is you've got white teachers teaching critical race theory, and they're not from the experience that what you're coming from. So it's a whole different ballgame when a white person's giving this kind of process of the Black experience, when, like I said, you can't even read that Black experience. And to a 4 or 5 year old, I don't want to take you down this path. I just wanted to
No, it's fine. It's fine. But that's why I was really intentional in my title, Origins and Scholarship, because I have white colleagues who teach critical race theory. So it's not, because then if we say, oh, it's all about our experience, it's like, well, then it's like, why would I always say to my students, why would I give you all this reading if I just want to hear about your personal reflections of the readings? It doesn't make any sense. And also, I don't come into class. I mean, students would love to hear me go on and on and on about stories, but I'm telling you, I am focused on those readings. And and if there's something that I can share personally that will actually, lend some kind of flesh to all of the theory, then so be it. But, it's not about, you don't, just like you don't have to be Black to be anti-racist. You don't, or you don't have to be a person of color to be anti-racist. You don't have to be a woman to be anti-patriarchy, or to be a feminist. I know, but and so that's a misnomer, that critical race theory doesn't come out of this history, not just of activism, but also scholarship. That's so incredibly important.
And that's a great place to have it, in a university setting, discussing it like you're doing, when people are old enough to handle it.
I hear you.
Not when they're 4 years old or 5 years old and they're sprung with this kind of mindset. And that's the problem.
No, so I just want to, I'm going to interject a little bit here to say I would really like to be clear about exactly what critical race theory is. And I don't believe, and I would like to hear your expert take on this, Ingrid, that I don't think anyone's teaching critical race theory to a 4-year-old. I don't think a 4-year-old has the intellectual capacity to understand it at age 4. I mean, reading the readings that we read today, put that reading in front of a 4-year-old, how much of that reading is a 4-year-old going to understand?
So from that perspective, Laurel,
okay.
in the Hayward
Thank
School
you, Paul.
District,
Paul,
they're doing
thank
that.
you.
Yeah.
I would like Ingrid to answer the question, please.
Yeah.
No, and I thank you. Thank you, Laurel. And Paul, what I want to say is I think that, there's a lot of misinformation about exactly what critical race theory is. I think that folks have, taken the term and made it into something that it isn't. I think that, I talk to kindergartners about, of course I frame it differently, but, my 7-year-old niece who goes to a Black-centered school in East Oakland, she can tell you about the civil rights movement. She can tell you about Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching campaign in the late 19th century. One of the things that is one of the most undertold stories is the fact that Black people's quest for civil rights in this country was also a quest for bodily integrity because of the kinds of sexual violence that Black people faced. And now, am I going to, talk, to my 7-8-year-old niece about that? No, but she knows at least the baseline facts about lynching, right? And knows about civil rights activists, but she also can tell you about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and all these folks. And so she has a very broad view of history. And I think that if we're talking about American kids actually being equipped to think critically and have this broad perspective about history and life, I think that we are doing justice to our kids. I like the fact that when students that I've taught go to other schools and they say, wow, Ingrid, you all are doing great things in Black studies because these students are super smart, and not just smart about what they've learned in Black studies, but because Black studies isn't simply about Black people. It's really about Black people's existence within the universe, basically, or, the planet. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
So we have another question from Betsy King.
Hi, Betsy.
Yes, thank you. I would just like to make a quick comment about what you have been talking about, because I am a former elementary school teacher, and I have taught in schools that had many, many different kids from all around the world. I taught overseas. And so because the children are faced with those. It's a different story when it's a school where maybe there are very few children of color or of a different ethnic group. And it has to be done so carefully. And I know what happens when there's a new thing to teach and everybody's like, yes, we're going to do this. They grab the materials and they just do it without any training, without any work between the teachers talking about how is this going and it's just blossomed up. And so I really understand that there will be teachers that are not teaching well and are doing things that are harmful. I think that that's important for us to recognize and acknowledge. And, it could very well be these, court cases could be justified, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. What we need to do is get better at it and think about what's appropriate for each grade level and not try to really, because I think it's important for kids that are really little to start understanding, because they see color. You can pretend that they're not supposed to.
At 4 years old, that's what research shows. At 3 or 4 years old, kids can actually, they actually understand race. for all of
Yes.
its faults.
Right. And I think it's okay for them to talk about it. I think a lot of them are have so many questions. It should be more based on their questions than the teacher telling the kids. But that's a different, it also depends on your teaching style. But anyway, I really put up my hand a while back because I wanted to talk a little bit more about intersectionality.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people think that intersectionality means, okay, so you've got a strike against you because you're female. You've got a strike against you because you're gay. You've got a strike against you because you have disability. And they just kind of, so my goodness, you've got these three things, But intersectionality isn't just piling these, things that kind of reduce your status, but how they work together.
Yes.
So it's not, you're a Black woman. It's not just that you're a woman and you're Black and there you have it. How you're treated. Yeah. How you're treated is because you are a Black woman, which is different than if you were an Asian woman. And I think that's important for people to understand that it gets very complex. And no matter or what nice neighborhood you live in, you still can walk into a restaurant and they not serve you, and I mean, look at all of the high up, law professors and wealthy Black men can still be harassed and maybe, arrested because they forgot their keys and they're trying to get into their house. And
in
the
real
neighbor
estate.
says, yeah, it happened, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, I think that white people don't quite get that. So
I'm waving at my friend there.
okay.
And Betsy, yeah, absolutely. And I also want, as I said earlier, to get, my students to understand also that, our life, folks' lives are shaped by those. And yes, it's like for Black woman, there's no space in between the word Black and woman. It's together. But I mean, the same thing for, white male. I mean, white men's lives are shaped by race and genders. But I mean, we don't think about that because we only think that, race, gender, sexuality, class, it's like, oh, race, oh, now we got to talk about some Black people stuff, or gender, oh, we got to talk about some feminist women stuff, class, oh, now we're going to talk about some poor, lazy people stuff, sexuality, oh, now we're going to talk about some lesbian, gay stuff, but actually, but we also talk about, we flip it, and say, but, what about whiteness with regard to race? What about, being male with regard to gender? What about the privilege that comes with being straight in our society? And, what about being elite? About, not having to worry about paying bills, the 1%, right? Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to take one question from chat before we move on. We do have a couple more questions, hands raised, I mean. So what are some good answers to the question, what is critical race theory?
Yeah. And, and this is why, I shared the reading, what is critical race theory, the origins, what is it? And that last section and those 6 defining elements. But, when you read that piece, I mean, Matsuda et al. Are very clear that, it comes out of this history, again, of, grappling with how racial inequality shapes the law, right? But that doesn't mean, again, that 6 defining element is like, but, critical race theorists work to actually dismantle inequality wherever inequality arises. But critical race theory is, I mean, it begins within the context of legal theory, right? But folks like me who actually come out of a social science background and not a legal background have actually appropriated it to say, hey, look, and certainly as a Black studies scholar, I'm like, yeah, this is, this is what we've been, studying for, some time. W.E.B. Du Bois, he writes The Souls of Black Folk in 19, and W.E.B. Du Bois, a famous sociologist, he was the first African-American to earn a PhD at Harvard. He earned it in sociology, but then he couldn't get a job at Harvard. He had to go away to Germany. And then he came back to this country and he worked at a couple of historically Black colleges and universities. But W.E.B. Du Bois said in 1903, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And it was easy for him to predict that because of the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson rule that stated, look, segregation is legal. Separate but equal facilities are fine. But we know that facilities for Blacks were inferior to those of whites. Trains, railway cars. So it's not as if critical race theorists, critical race theory emerged in the early 1980s and saying anything new with regard to, okay, there is structural racism. And one of the areas where we see this happening is in the law and order. We knew this, but I think one of the most important interventions that critical race theories makes actually is within the context of studying the law. And that's what Matsuda and all point out in that introduction. So critical race, but critical race theory is part of really a long history, certainly of Black scholars and leaders saying that, hey, race matters, but also gender matters as well. Again, Black women were saying this, going back to the turn of the 20th century with the Black Women's Club movement. And so, again, when we talk about critical race theory, again, it has its origins in legal theory. But those students like Marie Matsuda and Kim Crenshaw and their professors, Delgado and Lawrence, were saying, but we don't see racial injustice being grappled with at all or enough within the context of legal studies, but also critical legal studies. And that's what Matsuda and her co-authors point out in that introduction to Words That Wound. So I think that's really, and that's why origins are so important, even when origins are problematic. None of this stuff is happening in a vacuum. But I also think that, one of the things, Betsy made a great point that, there are some folks who actually say, I support critical race theory, but have they really read critical race theory? And so, it's just not the critics, but there are also some folks who say, well, I'm teaching critical race theory. It's like, well, are you really teaching critical race theory? Or perhaps you're teaching ethnic studies, or perhaps you're teaching ethnic studies through your own personal lens, and that can be problematic if folks aren't trained. But are teachers really getting trained to teach critical race theory, or to teach ethnic studies, or to teach feminist studies, or to teach LGBTQ studies? And so that's where, we have to really think about how teachers are being trained. And at UCSB, we have a great Exito 4+1 program in which Black studies, Asian American studies, Chicano studies, and feminist studies. We actually have a 5-year BA MA program where students actually they earn their degrees in one of our departments, but they get credentialed in ethnic studies. So we're so excited to graduate the first group this coming year, because they're actually going to be hired as ethnic studies teachers at a school, but they're actually going to be trained. But we're also doing some summer institute things in the coming years. We got a big grant because, again, no one can just pop up and say, I'm going to teach chemistry, I'm going to teach biology. Who does that? And so, we have to be trained because it's not about, I remember literally when I was an assistant professor at Virginia Tech, one of my colleagues said to me that, you have a PhD, you're Black and you have a PhD in ethnic studies, but that colleague also said a similar thing to a colleague, a Black female in religious studies. And this colleague, in well-meaning, but really thought that we did not have to carry out rigorous original research, that all we had to do when we defended our dissertation and took our qualifying exam was to just talk about our personal experiences. I'm like, what? No, that's no, who would even allow that? I wouldn't even allow that.
You touched on it briefly, but I wanted to see if you could make a little bit more of a distinction between critical race theory and the teaching of history to younger age groups. And I know Betsy touched on it and Paul touched on it. And I feel like it feels still to me a little muddy in this conversation. And I was hoping that you might be able to clarify it. And if it's maybe just a matter of semantics and that the term critical race theory isn't what it was back in the 90s when the readings you gave us were written, and now it has morphed into something that maybe is different and does encompass the teaching of history to younger students.
You know what? I think critical race theory has evolved because there are those of us who aren't law professors who actually teach critical race theory. But I think that it's become this tool for critics to say, hey, wait a minute, they're talking about institutionalized racism, talking about white privilege. And so I think that critical race theory has evolved, but I don't think it's evolved in the ways that so many critics they've made it out to be this monster that actually it isn't. And I think that, I think that, again, there are critics, but there are also those who, say, oh, well, I teach critical race theory, and they may know nothing about what went down at Harvard Law School in 1981. And I don't know how you teach something without, especially within, the humanities and social sciences, how you teach something without talking about origins. I would say the same thing about biology. How do you teach biology without knowing the origins of biology? And there's this whole history of biological racism. And so, I think that, when I read or hear these debates about critical race theory, I feel the same way as so many of my students feel, who I've taught over the past, 25 years, who are sending me emails, and those who have my phone number sending me texts like, Ingrid, Ingrid or Professor Banks, I don't see critical race theory in the way that I learned it in your class. I'm like, me either. I'm like, I don't know what these mugs are talking about, and that's why I think it's so important to actually find out exactly the origins of critical race theory, but then saying, hey, I just think that it's become a useful political tool for so many folks to say, hey, this is why the 1619 Project is problematic. This is why we shouldn't be teaching, about racial inequality. We need to be colorblind, and that's problematic because, of course, we can say that, hey, yeah, we should live in a society in which someone's race or gender, class, or sexuality doesn't matter, but we're not there. And I don't know if we'll ever get there, to be honest, but that doesn't mean that we, don't fight the good fight. Because I'm going to tell you, most of the students I've taught over my career have been white. And many of those students have said, Professor Banks, thank you. And some have gone off to law school. They said, thank you for teaching me about critical race theory, because I would have been the only one in my cohort who didn't know about critical race theory. They have said that. Like, thank you, because they weren't learning critical race theory, and they're learning, and what I put up on the PowerPoint slides in any other class. And so, and critical, all of this, it's for all of us. It's for all of us. It's not just for, folks of color, but, I just think that there is, being knowledgeable, and you don't have to agree with it. You don't, but at least you know the origins of something. And I think when you know context, you're better informed, and you do a better job at actually laying out your arguments. Because, that's one thing that I really frown upon in my classes, when students just want to come in and talk about their personal opinions without reading. I'm like, no, you got to be informed.
I want to take a question from William Wong.
You're muted, William.
Yeah,
There he goes.
I'm unmuted now. Thank you. I want to ask basically the same question that Laurel just put to you in a different way. I'm very interested in the ugly politics that has swirled around the misunderstanding of CRT. And I think most people are not at the academic level that you are, Ingrid.
Mm-hmm.
It's, in a way, it's too abstract and too theoretical for people. But what we've been hearing out there in the mass media in recent months are terrible school board meetings where parents who think they know what CRT is are berating school board members for whatever is being taught in their K-12 schools. And isn't it a matter of boiling it down to how American history is taught in schools? And the way I like to frame it is that there is a good America, the exceptional America, where people from all the lands around the world have sent people, and there have been wonderful opportunities to achieve the American dream, however we want to define that. That's one of the historical narratives that that boils down to the good America. But then there is the bad America, the slavery America, the genocide of native peoples America, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese American internment, and the way we currently treat and the continuing anti-Semitism that never goes away, despite the fact that Jewish Americans are among our leading people in the arts and culture and academia and everywhere else, and the anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant sentiments that are out there. So there are these two Americas that need to be taught in the schools, yet it's a very difficult challenge, I suppose, for curriculum writers to be able to do it in a way that won't spark conservative parents, Trump lovers to go to board meetings and intimidate people and threaten their lives. So what are your thoughts on the very practical thing that's going on in American politics today?
Yeah, and thanks for that, William. And thanks for bringing up the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and Pearl Harbor. Well, what happens with Japanese American citizens being interned on the West Coast, but also in Arizona after that attack. But, you know, the problem is that we disengage history, because all of that, what's termed as good and bad, that's all American history. And we got to understand that we got to take the good and the bad, but you know, the problem is that what's seen as bad is what makes white people uncomfortable. That's the issue. It's not the ways in which black people's bodies have been exploited over the course of this, you know, nation, and even before the republic became a nation, during colonial times, you know, because there was colonial slavery, but also antebellum era slavery. And so, you know, if we could just think about this as a part of the entire, you know, understanding, you know, that bad history is just part of American history. And just recognizing that if we want, you know, we should be able to teach, and our, you know, kids should be able to learn not just the good, but also what's seen as bad, right? Because the good is supposed to, not deal with any, anything that's fraught with any type of injustice, right? Anything that makes folks feel uncomfortable, but there's a way to actually, teach the material such that, we understand this is a part of our heritage. It is part of our national, history, of our narrative as a republic, as citizens. And so, I embrace being an American citizen, but I embrace the ugliness, the greatness. I embrace it all, again, I've sat in classes in which professors have referred to Black people as niggers. I've been that student. And the white students are turning around and looking at me like, you're going to say something? You're the only blood in here, But I'm like, what? I'm trying to get my grade. I'm trying to, get to law school. Back then, now I'm a professor, but folks aren't concerned, or generally speaking, these critics aren't concerned when students of color or even LGBTQ students, regardless of race, are offended when they're sitting in classrooms. And that's the problem. That's the problem. It's that, well, we're concerned as white folk when we are attacked, or our kids are going to be made to feel like they are the oppressor or they're bad people. It's not even about that. It's not about that. It's about saying, hey, this is just as much a part of our history and important as the founding of our republic. And that founding actually was about, colonists standing up and saying, we are being oppressed by the crown. But then it also becomes, the right for those colonists to continue to enslave people of African descent. So there's the hypocrisy there. And so we can't just gloss, or we can't, it's like, the good history is good for some folk. At least some people think that, but I think that excluding, histories, experiences, that harms all of us, not just those of us who, occupy, some kind of quote unquote subordinate, status, but it harms all of us. And I have white students who understand this. Like, they know I am better going to law school, better going to medical school. And I write these letters of recommendation, better going to medical school, law school, graduate school, doing social work, because of what I've learned in Black studies classes, other ethnic studies classes, feminist studies classes, I think that, the generation that's coming up now, those elementary school kids and middle school kids and high schools, I mean, I hope, but I think that they're going to just have a better view than those of us who came up during previous gen. I mean, I'm going on 56, so I was born during the civil rights era. And the things that, the kids who are in my orbit that they know, and they're learning, they're just not learning it at home, but they're learning it in school, So when my soul son says, hey, I saw a documentary today, and one of your colleagues, George Lipset, was actually one of the persons who was an expert, on the era of Reconstruction. I was like, wow, yeah, I showed that film in my college class. Now, I mean, he's a middle school student, but, and this brings up what some folks have been saying that, there's some tough stuff, things that, you don't, you don't have to relay even some of the most horrific experiences that Black people and Native Americans and Asian Americans and brown people have experienced in this country, or even women, regardless of race. You don't have to, you don't have to present it in the same way you would for college students. And so even for some of the college students, it can wreck them, but there are ways to do this. There are ways to do this, and there are elementary school teachers who actually are trained in that type of pedagogy. So, so I can talk about, Rosa Parks, but also Claudette Colvin, who actually came before Rosa Parks, and she was beat. I mean, she was a teenager who was beat off a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And she's taken to police headquarters and beaten outside of police headquarters by two cops because she refused to get out of her seat so a white person could, sit there. But I can talk about these things without, being graphic explicit, but to say that this is a perfect example of why race matters in this country and how Black people have not always had equal protection under the law, even though the 14th Amendment says that every American citizen has equal protection under the law. It's just not, because a law becomes empty when it goes unenforced. And kids understand this. They understand that, if you say, you know what? If you do something you're not supposed to do, you're not going to get any ice cream. But then a parent or guardian might say, all right, you did something you should not have done, but you're still going to get that ice cream. The kid is going to keep doing it because the rule isn't enforced. But if you enforce it, and those are the kinds of things that at least I do when I'm talking about, talking about inequality to any. I mean, I talk to preschoolers, and again, not going to be throwing up, pictures of, lynching, but, saying, hey, I learned in elementary school that Rosa Parks was a tired old Black lady and she just wanted to sit down. Totally undermine Rosa Parks' activism going back decades before she even got on that bus. And Mr. Blake, the bus driver, had her taken off. She had a run-in with Blake 10 years before. She was doing this kind of work in terms of, she was actually on investigator for the NAACP against sexual crimes that Black people were facing, because Black people were standing up and saying, look, we should have the right to vote, or trying to, organize sharecroppers. and not just Black sharecroppers, but white sharecroppers as well. So this is part of our history. We got to take the good and the bad, but also say, hey, that, yeah, those things happen in the past, but let's make sure that they're not happening, that they don't happen again. But just like with the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 and the internment of Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor, attack, we see anti-Asian hatred and violence happening in this country. And it is unacceptable. It is unacceptable. But it's happening simply because people really believe that, Asians are the reason for, the COVID-19 pandemic. But the problem is that we get these sound bites, right? And I think, William, you were saying this. And that people, and I'm not saying that people are like ignorant in terms of like stupidity, but it's so easy to get duped. And that's why those of us who, have the ear of our families, our neighbors, and certainly someone like me as a teacher, that is something that, because people see me as an authority figure in terms of what I know, and I hold that dear. And I'm not going to pass on misinformation to my students. Absolutely not. But there are millions of Americans. If you just tell them something, they hear it on Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, they automatically believe it. But we have to be able to think for ourselves and also go out and find information that is actually accurate, even when we don't agree with it. I know some Republicans. In fact, one Black Republican has my phone number. Yeah, he's a friend. All right.
Thank you so much. There are still more questions we didn't get to. We have 2 minutes left.
And Lois,
yeah, go ahead, Lois.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Banks, for being here. And my question to you is, with all the town experience and all those things you had, how did you choose to add critical race theory to what your repertoire is?
Well, again, as a Black studies scholar, one of the things that we understand quite clearly is that, racism isn't, we can't define racism as bigotry. It is structural, it is institutionalized. We see it again within education, housing, employment, income. And, one of the things that I always tell my students, I remember, watching All in the Family, and perhaps some of you remember this too, Archie Bunker, he was bigoted against everybody. Black people, women, regardless of race, Catholics, Jewish folk, everyone. And one of the things I always explain to my students, and again, critical race theorists understand that racism is structural. In fact, that's in this chapter that some of you read. But one of the things I say to students in trying to really get them to understand that racism isn't simply about bigotry, it's when those bigoted ideas are actually supported by institutions and structures of power in our society, like law, like order, like educational institutions, right? Because Archie Bunker, he can think whatever he wants to think about Black people, but his ideas have actually been supported in this country for centuries. And I'm not saying that we have not made strides. We have, but we still have a ways to go. And then Archie's neighbor, George Jefferson, who's bigoted against white folk. You hear George George Jefferson going off of, calling white people, these pejorative names. But here's the difference. George Jefferson's ideas have not been supported by institutional structures of power, because there has not been any kind of system in this country that has systematically denied white people access to social, political, and economic opportunities because they are white. There's not, so George is going, but Archie, yeah, there has been a system in place for centuries that has denied Black people access and equal access to social, political, and economic opportunities. And that's something that critical race theory actually illustrates. And then, but I mean, there's lots of scholarship outside of critical race theory that aligns with critical race theory. So that's how I would answer that. And also intersectionality. I mean, I think Kim Crenshaw, I mean, she's, but I mean, again, you had Anna Julia Cooper, the great Black female educator who went to Oberlin in the late 19th century, and she went on and got a PhD at the Sorbonne in Paris. And, she writes this book, A Voice from the South, in which she's talking about intersectionality, how race and sex actually shape Black women's lives.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. And
I think Carol's hand was up. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Oh, but go ahead.
I just really appreciate you explaining that, because the intersectionality, I'm a parent of a daughter who's 32. She's done really fabulously, but I just think the intersectionality is like really, really important, because we're all more than one thing. And so
Absolutely.
Particularly our young people as they're growing up, let them know that whatever not complicates, but every combination of things you would be, you're just the best, and just
you're fabulous.
Just the best, and you're just the best. That's it. And you can do anything you want to do. And most important, just remind your community, I want to do what I want to do, and what are you guys going to do to help me?
I agree, Lois.
Oh, and one more question.
Lois, we're out of time. We're out of time, Lois. You're gonna have to hold your question.
Can Carol make her comments? I know her hand has been up. At least she's been doing
I don't
this.
see a Carol.
Oh, Carol.
See a
Carol Ekberg?
Yes, here I am.
Yes.
Okay, I did not see you at all. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
No, what I'm wondering is if it's possible to define CRT in a very simple way. If somebody said, what is it? Can you start it off in a way without giving a lot of examples?
Yeah.
I mean, it is complicated. I understand
Yeah.
that. But if someone said, what the heck is CRT? I mean, what are they talking about?
Right.
What would you say that would not lose somebody?
Sure.
Briefly, because we need to wrap up.
Right, and I will be brief. I would
Okay.
say, based on the origins, it comes out of an understanding of how race actually shapes the law and how race shapes legal studies. But I'll also say that critical race theory examines racism as structural, as systemic, and not simply about, oh, I hate somebody because of the color of their skin. And then finally, I would say that critical race theory works to actually eradicate all forms of inequality, not just racism. And this is where the intersectionality comes into play. So those are the three things. And that's really just coming out of that introduction in Words That Wound. So that's what I would say. So I mean, it comes out of legal studies, through the actual scholarship within legal studies, but also recognizing that racism isn't simply, individual or about bigotry or about hatred, but it's actually embedded with institutions and structures of power within our society, like schooling, employment, health. And we've certainly seen that within the context of the pandemic.
And it's important to understand the history, our history, in order to be open and understand how everybody is affected.
Absolutely, and I think that, we're all of us, regardless of our background, we are all connected, we're going, and now, obviously folks' lives, folks who have money are going to have different life chances, but if one thing the pandemic showed us, even though we saw the exacerbation of inequalities, COVID could come for any of us. It's more likely to come for folks who don't have the types of privileges that at least some of us have here. I'm not living. I wasn't an essential worker. I could do I could teach my classes on Zoom, so I didn't have to go out and be exposed to the virus. But that doesn't mean that it can't come for us. It can.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all of the questions. I'm really sorry that we were not able to get through them all, but I appreciate all of the questions. Dr. Banks, I am so glad that you were able to take the time out of your day and spend time with us. This was a wonderful dialogue. I wish we could go on, crack open a bottle of whiskey and continue into the night. But unfortunately,
well, maybe I'll come back. But I do want to say, Laura, and I want to say thanks to the League of Women Voters, the Piedmont chapter, and also the Piedmont anti-racism, racist and diversity committee. And I like to just be informed about things. I read books about carburetors. Not that I want to work on, but I'm just interested. And so I like knowledge. I am a lifelong student. And so I like to share what I know with others that they will then go on and share with, folks at the dinner table. But, this has been great. And I think that it's when we can have these conversations and these dialogues, particularly in a civil, respectful way, that, we all benefit. Because at the end of the day, in one way or another, a lot of us we all catch hell, but we catch hell to varying degrees based on our subject positions. And that's what we have to understand and just recognize that. And
we are all on this planet together.
Yes, we are. And so in some ways we rise and fall,
together.
COVID has shown us this.
Absolutely. Thank you again so much. Thank you again. And I am